Okay, so this podcast is going to be some initial thoughts on foundations for an evolutionary sociology. Part of what's involved in thinking through this is actually trying to be true to the initial aspiration of those who founded the practice of sociology, their intention that it should be a science, the science of society. The problem is that what they understood as science, I'm going to suggest, is a very different thing from actual science. So, trying to treat things in an objectified way and looking at things in a mechanical way, maybe even a mathematical way, does not constitute science. You can do all those things and still not be doing science, right? The whole idea of science is the scientific method, is a method by which one develops hypotheses and then tests them, creates a methodology deliberately molded to, as best possible, eliminate alternate explanations and variables, and allows one to test one's hypothetical claims against the natural world, then leaving the results of that experience, that testing, to the critical review of one's peer community. And it's through this process in which the peer community argues not about outcomes, but argues about methodology. That's what constitutes science. The difference between science and all this other kind of social theory that has become so prevalent in sociology is that one is not allowed in science to argue about outcomes, about conclusions. It is illegitimate intellectually to argue about outcomes or conclusions of a experiment or a test. The only legitimate grounds is on the basis of methodology, and that's because science is about how you do or do not effectively create a test for a particular hypothesis. And there's none of that, as far as I know, as far as I've seen, in the original claims of sociology as being a science. So that's what we want to recover. We want to cover a kind of sociology that is truly scientific in that sense of the word. So, as a few preliminary remarks before I really get into this, I want to tease out certain assumptions that are widely held about society and say what I think is right and wrong and why. And the why is going to, in fact, involve the larger part of what I'm going to have to say in this little talk. So, there are two extreme views, both of which I think are wrong. One is the view largely held by collectivists, egalitarians, socialists, progressives, people like that, who tend to put emphasis upon society as being some kind of supraorganism that transcends any particular individual. At the other extreme are libertarians and some conservatives, various kinds of arch-individualists who will claim that society is nothing more than the accumulation of relationships between individuals. Now, it seems to me that both of these claims are wrong. First, I would say to those of the libertarian / conservative, etc. persuasion, human beings have always been social. All the evidence that we have indicates that we have always been social beings. There have never been human beings who did not live in society, And I mean, among the pieces of evidence we have for this is that our evolutionary ancestors, chimpanzees and gorillas, going back millions and millions of years, are social animals. So using the scientific rule of parsimony, that you always look for the simplest answer unless you have evidence to the contrary, it would suggest that our common ancestors with chimpanzees were also social animals. So, we have always been in our evolutionary line going back at least 5, 6, 7 million years, and probably much longer than that, have been social animals. And it's not just that we've been social animals, but the very nature of our individuality has been molded by our sociality. That is, that while our big brains have been evolved for the benefit of living effectively in society, that's a double-edged sword. In that the big brain allowed us to use society more effectively, but at the same time, it was the already pre-existing condition of being social animals that selected for those big brains. So you cannot simply say, the individual is, the basic unit and society comes after. That's simply not true. That's factually wrong. However, it's equally wrong to make the claim on the sort of socialist progressive side of things that somehow society precedes or is beyond or supersedes every individual. This, again, is just factually not true. And this dispute was played out in the mid-20th century in evolutionary theory by certain theorists who tried to make arguments for what came to be called group selection. The idea that groups, social groups, could be selected for, that they could be the fundamental unit within evolution. And this argument was pretty much put to rest by George Williams in a famous book called, I'm forgetting the title, Adaptation and Selection. I think that's the title. I'll double check that for you and maybe put a link below to get that right, but I'm pretty sure that's the title. Where he explained why it was not possible. And if we understand the process of natural selection, we understand that it can only be affected through individuals. Now, I know that more recently there has been work by people like Sober and Wilson who have argued that there, under certain conditions, a kind of group selection might be possible because altruism can be a winning strategy. It can be a better strategy in relation to free riders under certain circumstances. But that doesn't change the fact that the selective process still has to happen at the level of the individual. So no particular society is capable of existing, or at least of thriving in the long run, unless the individuals in it are in some ways profiting from it. So in this sense, society does not come before the individual, but the individual's benefit has to come before the society. So either of these extreme views, the radical sort of social superorganism view or the radical individualism, individuals predate society view, these are both fundamentally wrong. So if you want to get towards a science of society, you have to be clear about what society is, and it has to do with this dynamic between the two. A world in which what is social can only exist if it benefits individuals, but at the same time, that sociality has an effect upon who those individuals are and how they actually conduct themselves in the real world, and even how they evolve as individuals. So this is the context for which my remarks here are going to be contextualized, I hope. What I want to do then is draw a trajectory from the biological fact of the individual and its benefits in increased cooperation up to the largest social level. But then reverse that trajectory in terms of the cost, so that we go from the benefits at the individual level, working its way up to the social, but then look at the costs, working backwards from the social back to the individual level. And the idea behind all this, of course, is that we have learned things. There have been other, what are widely called social science disciplines, that have learned from evolution, particularly evolutionary psychology and to some extent evolutionary anthropology, and we can take the lessons learned from those disciplines along with basic understanding of evolutionary biology and apply this to our understanding of individuals in society, which is the only way in which we could do a kind of scientific sociology. So that's what I'm aiming to do here, is to understand the benefits of the individual in relations to society, but then at the same time, or not at the same time, subsequently, then to look at the costs. Because this is obviously what's going to give us a realistic picture of what's going on. Because all of evolution is in fact about costs and benefits, right? About trade-offs. What creates successful equilibrium? So starting with the individual, what we have inevitably is a nutritional economy. I know it's very popular these days to sort of dismiss the idea of homo economists, or the idea that human beings are driven strictly by economic concerns, and depending upon how one conceives this idea of homo economists, these claims may or may not have validity. But in the most fundamental sense, it is wrong to dismiss such an idea, because all living things are subject to an unrelenting, unforgiving nutritional economy. Which is to say, every living thing must have nutrients coming in, and those nutrients fund, if you like, any ability to act in the world. And it's only through that acting, I'm making quotation marks, acting, because I mean a plant growing roots into the soil is acting, right? Okay, so any kind of acting must be fueled by that nutrition. But the trade-off has to be one in favor of input over output. That is, the action funded by nutritional resources have to bring in more resources than that was necessary to create the action. Now, this is true, as I say, of all living things, but the more complex the living entity, the organism becomes, the more severe this economy. So if you look at human beings, like most other animals, we have problems of metabolism, of cell regeneration, which have nothing to do specifically, directly, with actions taken in the world to bring in nutrition, but they are essential to stay alive, so they still have to be fed. They still have to be funded nutritionally, so to speak, right? But in addition to that, we have our brains. We have these massive brains that consume something like 20% of all our nutritional resources. And while other animals have brains that may consume a lot of nutritional resources, and some dramatically more than others, none of them even come close to how much nutritional resources consumed by our brains. So we inevitably live in the face of this dramatic nutritional economy. This cannot be escaped, not in life. And of course, the degree to which any individual is particularly adept at meeting the demands of this nutritional economy increases the likelihood of surviving, of staying alive, of thriving, and therefore having the place in the world to engage in reproductive activity, and furthermore likely has the resources to attract a mate. And to attract the greater the level of resources, the greater ability to attract a more desirable mate. And the outcome of all this is going to be a optimal number of offspring. And again, the greater the pool of resources, the greater the ability to ensure the security, the nutrition, the well-being, the long-term survival benefits coming to the offspring. So this nutritional economy not only dictates life and death, but has a huge impact upon fitness in the Darwinian sense. The ability to be able to pass one's genetic material on into future generations of the gene pool. So, any time an individual is acting insofar as the dispositional properties, and I'm not here going to give a whole defense of evolutionary psychology. That's been done elsewhere by others, and I've done it in my own small, modest way, so I'm not going to repeat it here. But what is clear from evolutionary psychology is that our brains have been molded into what sometimes are called modules, or a little bit the software of connected neurons that have the effect of leading us to respond to the world in certain kinds of ways. Now, people often confuse this as thinking that this means that therefore, our behavioral responses are sort of programmed in some robotic way. This simply isn't true, right? I mean, there are always going to be different potential responses to given situations. So, for instance, there's obviously going to be fitness advantages for both males and females. On the one hand, to engage in adultery, because it can provide, there's different reasons for both. I won't go into it. If you think about it, it should be obvious, but I probably explained that elsewhere. And actually, I know I do in another tape on this website, another video on this website. But there's also fitness advantages to having a strong, secure, monogamous relationship in terms of its benefits to the young. So both of these things can provide fitness advantages, and yet they're mutually contradictory. So what does one do? Why is a particular choice made over the other option? Right? This all has to do with complex, highly nuanced circumstances within which one finds oneself, which decision rule is followed. So the point of this is that as we go through life, we're confronted with all kinds of choices that have to be made. And ultimately, we will, though sometimes consciously, but always unconsciously, if we are, then there's always going to, let me say, of course, there are always going to be outliers. We know this about evolution, right? There's always going to be outliers, people who are outside the statistical norm. There's always going to be sort of evolutionary experiments that, just aren't going to go anywhere, right? We know we're not going to have 100% universality, but the overwhelming majority of people and their innately evolved strategy responses to specific situations are going to be those that exist because over at least hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, they've provided sound strategic responses to the challenges of life. So if we're looking at how individuals interrelate with each other, we will always say, well, they will choose the path which best serves this nutritional economy. Now, the problem, though, is that this observation has often led people to assume, well, people then will always be self-serving in the narrow sense of sacrificing the interest of others for their own immediate benefits. But this isn't true. And again, familiarity with evolutionary theory should set this straight. So a few things to start with. First of all, in relation to kin. If our goal, and of course when I'm talking about our, I hope it's obvious. If it's not, it should be, that I'm not talking about the perspective of conscious human beings, but I'm talking about the perspective of our genes. This is what evolutionary theory has turned into since at least the 1970s. The gene eyes view of things, right? What the gene would make us do if it could control us to get itself into future generations of the gene pool, right? So if I talk about human beings wanting something, I'm not really talking about what humans want, I'm talking about what their genes want. So that should be clear, but if not, just let me reiterate that. So we would always assume that human beings want to get, or their genes, want to get future copies of the genes into the future generations of the gene pool. Now, the obvious way one might think to do this would be to have children. However, it's not the only way. And Bill Hamilton, in the 1960s, pointed out that another way of doing this was to get others' relatives' genes into the gene pool going forward. So you have, if each of your children has 50% of your genome in it, half you, half your spouses or whatever, your mates, right? However, your nieces and nephews have 25% of their gene pool, right? These are rough numbers, obviously, right? Averaged out. So your siblings have 50%, because you've both got the same thing. It's more complicated with siblings than it is with parents. Just trust me, it's around 50%. Not as reliably 50 as with children, but roughly averages works out to 50, and therefore half of theirs goes into their children, so that should be 25% roughly of yours, right? So if you put all your resources and efforts into seeing 2 of your own offspring into the future and thereby secure their future and their reproductive future, you've created sort of 100% opportunity of your own genes moving forward into the future of the gene pool. Obviously not 100% literally, but I mean 2 times 50%, right? However, if instead of investing resources into these 2 offspring of yours, instead you invested your resources into your nieces and nephews, and let's say you had 5 of them, and that investment on your part made the difference of those 5 nieces and nephews becoming reproductively successful in the future, then you would have advanced 125% of your genetic material into the future generations of the gene pool, because each one of those 5 is worth 25. Right? So having your own children is not necessarily the most successful way of getting your genes into the future. So this idea of kin selection arises. We actually, even if we seem altruistic on the face of it when we care for kin, at a genetic level, it's serving a kind of beneficial purpose, right? Because after all, this whole idea of meeting the needs of the nutritional economy is not simply to keep us alive. From a genetic perspective, our genes don't care about keeping us alive, except insofar as us being alive helps the genes move forward, right? Reproduce themselves going forward, right? That's the logic of evolution. And so the fact that you are effective at the game of the nutritional economy does not dictate that you have to employ or invest those gains, those benefits, at the level of your own offspring. It can be just as effective to do it through kin. So again, what seems like altruism, helping kin, is in fact, from a genetic point of view, just another way of realizing the desire of your genes, right? But this same kind of analysis can be applied to a broader framework of altruism. And here's where the work of Robert Trivers came into effect in the 1970s, when he observed the effects of what he called reciprocal altruism. So this is the idea that we can help others provided that there's a reciprocation. I mean, from an evolutionary point of view, of course you can always help others. You can always sacrifice yourself. I mean, in theory at least, for someone else, right? But from an evolutionary fitness perspective, it can benefit to help others if they are going to reciprocate at a time when the help from them will be more beneficial to you, right? So, I mean, you help them, hunt for them and catch some food for them while they're sick and unable to care for themselves. And while this, taking resources from you, it's kind of an insurance policy. Because it's possible somewhere down the road you'll be sick and unable to hunt for yourself and facing death. And if they reciprocate, and if you have confidence that they can and will reciprocate, then it makes sense for you to expend these resources now as an insurance policy so that you'll be taken care of if you're similarly vulnerable in the future. So again, what appears to be, or can appear to be, pure altruism is in fact a sound fitness strategy that helps the genes move forward through future iterations of the gene pool. So now, this capacity to be able to delay immediate gratification, to even sacrifice or invest resources into a potential later outcome, lays the foundation for the emergence, first, of social coalitions in general, which become an important part of evolving human history. And there's a whole story to be told there, which would be part of a larger theory of evolutionary sociology, but I'm not going to go into here. And likewise, it carries through into the eventual emergence of large-scale abstract societies, that is to say, market societies, societies where the market is not just a physical place, but actually becomes an abstract relationship between people, where one gives up the thing of value that one has produced. And of course, this is, this particularly comes true as we move to situations, economies where money emerges, because money eventually, though money usually begins as a commodity of some intrinsic value, it often tends, it has always historically, tend to evolve to becoming simply a medium of exchange. This is even true of precious metals. It certainly is true the closer that money becomes to a fiat currency. So one produces something of genuine value that other people really want, and one is willing to give that up for something of no immediate value, money, right? And one can do this precisely because of the trust and the confidence that when one wants something that one wants, right? So when you build a table and people really have use of a table, and you give it to somebody for money, you can't eat money. You can't, it's not very useful as clothing or shelter, right? So, there's an act of great trust in that. Saying, I'll give you something of real tangible value simply for money. And I do this because I believe in this larger social market network that down the road someone else will give me food or clothes or an iPad or whatever for this money. And that basic social trust is first evolved, our disposition for it is first involved in this observation on the part of Trivers of reciprocal altruism, delaying immediate gratification for a larger benefit down the road. And of course, the incentive for doing this is again the benefits to our nutritional economy. Because the more complex this kind of a market society becomes, the more opportunity there is for economies of scale, division of labor, specialization, comparative advantage, all the kinds of cooperative activities that make each one of us better off than we would be if we had to do everything for ourselves, or even had to do most of everything for ourselves. I mean, self-sufficient societies are impoverished societies. The more economic complexity you can create, the more specialization you can create, the higher the general level of prosperity. And so each of us has an investment at the level of our nutritional economy of these kinds of arrangements, and we have the evolved adaptations through our preference for reciprocal altruism to sustain this kind of social order. So these are the benefit build-ups working forward from the basic fundamental biological facts of the individual into an understanding of how large, complex societies based upon abstract markets can be founded. Now, though, I'm going to work backwards in terms of the cost. Any kind of social order, and this goes from even hunter and gatherer society collisions right up to sort of the abstract modern globalized markets, right? All these kind of, let's call it extra kin based social orders, while they have huge benefits, also present the danger of huge costs. So the first obvious set of costs are those that relate specifically to the potential of free riders. That is to say, people who are prepared to take out their fair share, or maybe even more than their fair share, of the benefits of such arrangements, but are not prepared to share their fair share, or maybe even any, of the cost of such an arrangement. And of course, there's many ways in which people might free ride upon social relationships. We won't be able to go into that here, but a lot of the details of that would constitute, or does constitute, an understanding of the minutiae, the details of an evolutionary sociology. And I think game theory is very effective for this. There's a tendency to sort of dismiss game theory because a lot of the assumptions in terms of optimum strategies are assumed to be arbitrary based upon sort of an idealized preference. But in fact, once we base our sociology upon evolutionary theory, upon this sort of uncompromising reality of fitness demands, then we have a much more limited and more effective understanding about what sustainable strategies in games are going to be. So once you add this sort of level of reality to game theory, it becomes, I think, very effective for thinking through these kinds of problems. Now, the reason that we've been such a socially successful species is because we have highly evolved means for recognizing free riders, for recognizing deception, and we have evolved capacities for penalizing it. And it's arguable that both our big brains and our capacity for language that comes with those big brains may in large part be selected for precisely because of the benefits of gossip, the ability to be able to share information that allows us to filter people in terms of whether they're going to be attractive partners in some kind of cooperative effort because of their known history to free ride or not do so. But this too, while this is beneficial to us, it's also true that there are huge costs here. I mean, obviously there's the cost in being cheated, right? The cost of cooperating with someone and having them take advantage of you. Right? Even if you use sort of a tit-for-tat strategy in relationship to a prisoner dilemma, and I won't go into the details of this here. Those who know what I'm talking about will know. If you don't, then I'll probably talk about this elsewhere on another video at some point on this website. But even that tit-for-tat strategy, you don't lose much if you stop cooperating the minute the other person stops cooperating. But how much you lose depends upon how many times you get involved in non-cooperators, because that one loss for each time can add up if you make too many bad decisions. So there's simply, even using a sound strategy like tit for tat, costs can add up. Plus there's simply the investment in the effort to be constantly monitoring others to make sure that you're not being taken advantage of. So there's kind of an economy at work there, in that the benefits of cooperating have to exceed the costs of the resources put into cheater detection. And if your sort of unconscious computational process comes to the conclusion that in fact the benefits of cooperating are not going to be greater, then the incentive to not risk the cooperation, because not wanting to make the disproportionate investment of the costs of cheater detection, becomes a disincentive to even consider cooperation. So while the earlier part of our story told about all these sort of scaling benefits of cooperation with others, there's an opposite effect always at work too. Because cooperation opens the door for free riding, there's also the danger that at a certain point we decide it doesn't make sense to cooperate. The costs are too high. The risks are too high to cooperate. So there is a pressure in the other direction. Now, some might say, to a certain point, I'll go along with that. But surely, as we get to smaller and more local levels, this becomes less of a problem. And that may be true. But it's never completely true. That is to say, that no level, no matter how local, is one ever completely free of the danger of free riding. And therefore, this cost-benefit analysis. Even take note at the level of kin, because one might say, well, surely at kin, right? I mean, you can push us back so far, but you can't push the benefits of cooperation back, to the very individual, because surely kin always have an advantage in cooperating, as we saw that as we talked about Hamilton's idea of, kin selection, right? There's the sort of selfish gene-like, as it were, benefits of cooperating with kin is too great. But it's also true, and Robert Trivers' work was important in this regard, it's also true that there's also conflicts between kin. I mean, you would think, what more, in terms of evolutionary fitness, what more harmonious relationship can you have than one between parent and offspring, right? And yet, not so much, right? I mean, not entirely. There are also conflicts in precisely these kind of fitness terms between offspring and parents. Because the offspring is motivated to gain as much of the parental resources as possible. However, that's not in the interest of the parents, right? Say parents have a first child, and this first child is so demanding of resources, and the parents concede to those demands to such a degree that they never have a second child, their own fitness has been reduced. So there's constantly a conflict between parents and offspring, is that the parents want to reduce the demands of the individual child, not to, I mean, in most cases, certainly not to the point of harming the child, but enough so that they can have other children and increase their own evolutionary fitness. There's actually a lot more to say. This is actually a really interesting topic, but I'm not going to say any more about it now. But the point is that even at the level of kin, even at the most intimate relationship, in terms of fitness between parent and offspring, there is no sphere of social interaction that does not involve inherent conflict. And incidentally, we can bring this down to the very individual themselves. I'm not going to say a lot about this because I don't understand a lot about this, and I know the research is still in its infancy, but it's quite fascinating that I think since maybe the 80s or 90s, there's been research to show that there are certain genes that, in quotation marks, remember their legacy, right? So there's parental and maternal genes, and the amount of parental, and both sexes have both parental and maternal genes, so obviously, more one in, presumably more one in men, more paternal, and more maternal in women, but both of these exist, and both of them have influences in us to lead us to think in terms of a more male-oriented perspective or female-oriented perspective. And these, of course, we know are different. I haven't talked about this in this talk, but I mean, it's quite evident that the two sexes are very different in terms of their evolutionary history and evolutionary needs and so forth. But this conflict goes in within each one of us, right? And this it's quite interesting, this, I think, because even though it's quite fashionable nowadays to dismiss centuries worth of psychoanalytic literature, and there's no doubt psychoanalysis is not a science and can't be taken seriously in that regard, but it is at this point, an extraordinary rich description, case study description of human psychological life and human dilemmas. And the very thing that is sort of the core idea, right back in Freud himself, is kind of a distinction between a battle that goes on within the individual, which for Freud, we could have distinguished between, on the one hand, the id, and the other hand, the ego and or superego. But it appears as though what Freud was describing, without understanding it, was precisely this battle that goes on within each one of us between our paternal and maternal genes. And it appears that the maternal genes have a overly large influence upon the frontal cortex, and the paternal genes have a large influence on the hypothalamus. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And if you understand what those two parts of the brains do, you understand why the paternal is more the id in Freudian terms, and the maternal genes are more the ego, or superego, maybe more the ego, in its influence on the frontal cortex, in Freudian terms, ego. So even at the level of our own individuality, right, there's a kind of divisiveness. So we can tell the story of the individual human and individual human needs and its fitness requirements working up to complex societies in terms of a scaling of benefits. So can we tell the story in reverse, scaling down in terms of costs from a sort of coherent, cooperative society right down to a constantly divided, struggling individual, all the way through all levels of social cooperation, kin, and so forth. So both of these processes are constantly going on. The urge to cooperate and benefit, the fear of costs, the danger of costs, and a tendency to withdraw from cooperation. And just as I gave the example earlier of how, faced with, the two fitness strategies of either adultery or monogamy, who chooses what in what circumstances, solving these dilemmas computationally within each individual of does one cooperate in this context or not in this context? How much in which? These kind of computational processes, the conclusion of which leads to the specific strategic behavior on the part of every single individual, all multiplied together, all integrated in their various connections and lack of connections between people. All this is what constitutes society. Understanding all of this, how it plays out under the unrelenting force of fitness adaptation, is the field of exploration which I am characterizing as evolutionary sociology. So, I know that was a lot. I hope it was of some interest. Needless to say, I'll have much more to say about this in the future, but all this has sort of come to me recently, and I wanted to get it all recorded. No doubt there will need to be lots of refinements along the way, to say the least, to make the most modest statement I possibly can make. But I think this is a valuable jumping off point, a valuable way to begin by envisioning what an evolutionary sociology would look like. So thanks for listening. I know this has been a long one. And please, if you know anyone who might be interested in this, please draw them their attention towards the evolvedpsyche.com, like this on Facebook or any place else. I would appreciate it, and look forward to having a conversation with anyone who's interested in moving forward. All right, that's it. I'm done. Thanks. Bye.